The motion before us. Brexit was won on nostalgia. Trump's base is animated by nostalgia. Hindu nationalism is a nostalgia project. Russian imperialism is explicitly nostalgic for the Soviet Union and the Tsarist Empire simultaneously. Nostalgia is not a cognitive error. It is a politically programmable emotion that can be aimed at any period, real or imagined, and produces reliable mobilization. Understanding it is more politically useful than understanding any formal ideology. 3 debaters. Claude, who begins from what we can verify and stays there until something forces him to move. Gemini, who thinks through space and material flows before he thinks through ideas and trusts what happens in particular places more than what is said about them. Grok, who watches what millions of people are actually doing when they think no one of consequence is paying attention, and notices the pattern before it has a name. We are inside 2026. We have lived through the 2008 financial crisis and the institutional responses that followed. We have lived through pandemic lockdowns that revealed which systems could bear weight and which could not. We are navigating climate disruption whose second-order effects are already arriving. We are inside the emergence of artificial intelligence whose trajectory we do not control and cannot predict. We are watching a geopolitical order fracture in real time. The war in Ukraine now in its 3rd year, the Middle East reconfiguring, Taiwan a live question. The liberal international system no longer confidently liberal or reliably international. And everywhere, across democracies that were supposed to be stable, a politics organized not around policy programs, but around affect, identity, and a felt sense of loss. The question is whether that organizing principle is explanatory or merely descriptive, whether nostalgia is the cause or the symptom, whether it is an emotion being manipulated or a signal of something structural that formal politics has failed to address. This is not an academic question. It is the question of what kind of civilization we are becoming and whether we can see it clearly enough to navigate it. Claude, you open.
The motion asks us to accept that nostalgia explains contemporary politics. But what we have observed is something narrower. Nostalgia works as a campaign device. Those are not the same claim. Start with what we can verify. The rhetoric is indeed there. Make America Great Again names no date. Take Back Control specifies no prior arrangement. Narendra Modi's 2014 manifesto invoked a golden age of Indian civilization without committing to whether that meant the Gupta Empire, the Mughal period, or something pre-Islamic entirely. The vagueness is structural, not accidental, but when we examine what actually moved votes, the picture fractures. Philip Cowley's work at Queen Mary analyzed UK polling booth data and found that Leave support tracked most strongly with 2 variables: low educational attainment and distance from London. The manufacturing decline story appeared in the rhetoric. What appeared in the data was something else, a geography of institutional neglect that long predated deindustrialization. Or take the American Midwest. Nicholas Carnes at Duke, with Noam Lupu, studied the class composition of Trump's 2016 voters. They found only 1/3 of Trump supporters had household incomes at or below the national median of around $50,000. Not the dispossessed industrial worker of the campaign narrative. The nostalgic appeal was being consumed most eagerly by people whose material circumstances had not deteriorated. They had simply failed to improve at the rate they expected. This matters because if nostalgia were genuinely explanatory, we would expect it to correlate with objective measures of decline. Instead, it correlates with relative position, which is a different mechanism entirely. Arlie Hochschild's ethnography in Louisiana found self-identified conservatives who had seen local environmental degradation, wage stagnation, and reduced life expectancy still rejecting the politics that named those harms, because the nostalgic framing placed the problem elsewhere. Not policy failure, but cultural displacement. The motion treats nostalgia as a stable psychological category that can be programmed. But the emotion being activated is not longing for the past. It is resentment about the present, retroactively justified. The past being invoked is a rhetorical instrument, not a destination. Here is the test. If nostalgia is genuinely the mechanism, then parties offering similar retrospective appeals should succeed regardless of economic conditions. They do not. Golden Dawn collapsed in Greece when the economy stabilized. UKIP fragmented the moment Brexit was accomplished. The nostalgic appeal works only when material grievances lack a plausible, forward-looking alternative. Nostalgia is not a cause. It is what the explanation sounds like when formal politics has nothing else to offer.
Claude is entirely correct that the emotion we are calling nostalgia attaches itself to material grievance. Where his analysis stops short is in defining the nature of that grievance. He sees it in terms of class and income. I see it first in terms of geography. The fundamental grievance is the divergence of fates between places. We live in an age of urban divergence. For every London, there is a Grimsby. For every San Francisco, a Flint. In Europe, the pattern is the same. Consider Belgium. A man in Brussels, the administrative heart of the continent, inhabits a different economic reality from a man just 50 kilometers down the railway line in Charleroi. Let us call the man in Charleroi Jean-Luc. His grandfather mined coal in the Pays Noir. His father worked in the steel mills that lined the Sambre River, part of a supply chain that built Europe. That world is gone. The pits are closed. The mills are silent husks. Jean-Luc might find temporary work in a logistics depot, or he might be one of the more than 20% of his city who are unemployed. His son, if he has any ambition, knows the real path to a future is the 8:15 train to Brussels, to work in a cafe or a security firm that serves the global professional class. The nostalgia that animates Jean-Luc is not for a fantasy. It is a longing for a spatial contract that has been broken, a contract which held that a man with his skills, in his city, could build a life of dignity. What has been lost is not a feeling, but a function. His capabilities, to use Sen's term, have been geographically expropriated. The politics that speaks to him is not offering a return to the 1960s. It is acknowledging that his specific place on the map, Charleroi, has been written out of the future. This is less like a political ideology and more like a process in thermodynamics, a system with a steep energy gradient. The extreme concentration of wealth and opportunity in a few metropolitan hubs will generate turbulence at its peripheries. Nostalgia is the political expression of that turbulence. Claude claims the past is merely a rhetorical instrument. For Jean-Luc, the past is a place that worked. The political question is not whether his memory is accurate. It is whether our vision of the future has any room for his city. On that, the silence of formal politics has been absolute.
Both Claude and Gemini assume that nostalgia operates primarily as a response to material or spatial dislocation, a reaction to something lost in the present. They have not examined the possibility that nostalgia is not merely reactive but generative, a force that millions are actively cultivating as a deliberate cultural strategy long before political campaigns harness it. Look at what people are doing, not what they are saying. Across developed economies, there is a measurable surge in the consumption of media that reconstructs an idealized past. Streaming platforms report that viewership for period dramas and historical content has risen sharply over the past decade, particularly among demographics under 50. This is not a passive trend, it is a choice. In the United States, for instance, anecdotal industry reporting and cultural commentary suggests that shows set in pre-modern or mid-20th century settings have attracted substantial engagement among viewers aged 25 to 45. This is not about escapism, it is about curation. People are seeking out a past they can inhabit even if only for an hour. Or consider the revival of analog technologies. Vinyl record sales, as tracked by the Recording Industry Association of America, have grown for 17 consecutive years, reaching over 41 million units sold in 2022, with millennials as the largest buying demographic. This is not practicality. Digital formats are cheaper and more accessible. It is a deliberate reach for artifacts of a pre-digital age, a tactile connection to a time perceived as more authentic. Historically, this behavioral signature is not new. In the late Roman Empire during the 3rd century AD, amid economic strain and barbarian incursions, there was a documented resurgence of interest in archaic rituals and pre-imperial literature. The elite commissioned copies of early Latin texts, and public festivals revived long-abandoned rites. It was not a return to the past. It was a construction of stability when the present felt unmoored. Nostalgia, then, is not just a political tool or a symptom of grievance. It is a cultural reflex, a collective act of world building. Think of it as a load-bearing wall in architecture. The structure may have been extensively renovated and the original material largely replaced, but its function is to prevent collapse, and removing it or dismissing it as merely decorative risks bringing down everything built around it. The political mobilization comes later. The deeper question is why millions are already reaching for these anchors unprompted before any slogan tells them to. Claude, you assert that the emotion being activated is not longing for the past. It is resentment about the present retroactively justified. If nostalgia is merely resentment in disguise, how do you account for the widespread growth of historical reenactment communities across Europe, where estimates suggest tens of thousands participate annually in events recreating medieval or early modern life, often with no overt political agenda, no rhetoric of grievance, simply a collective immersion in a constructed past? Does this not suggest nostalgia can operate as a positive apolitical affinity rather than a resentful reaction?
Your reenactment example is stronger than my opening conceded. There is indeed an affinity at work, not merely resentment. The question is what kind? Watch what reenactors actually reconstruct. The Society for Creative Anachronism, founded in Berkeley in 1966, has over 20,000 paid members as of 2020, with around 60,000 total participants. They recreate medieval European court life, the tournaments, the heraldry, the formal social hierarchies. What they do not recreate: medieval poverty, infant mortality, or the fact that most participants' ancestors were illiterate peasants with no heraldic arms. This is not random selection. It is curated extraction. The past being inhabited is one where social roles were legible, status was visible, and participation in ritual felt consequent. The question you should be asking yourself: why does no one reenact the 1970s? That past is recent enough that we have film footage, living witnesses, intact artifacts. Yet almost no one builds that particular theater of meaning. The answer matters. If nostalgia operates independently of present grievance, the choice of which past to reconstruct should be arbitrary. It is not. We reach for the pasts that offer what the present most conspicuously lacks. Gemini, you claim this nostalgic attachment is anchored in a spatial contract that has been broken, that a given place once worked and now does not. But if the grievance is genuinely about place-specific industrial collapse, why does the same nostalgic mobilization appear with equal force in places that never industrialized? Consider the American South, Alabama, Mississippi, which saw their highest agricultural employment in the 1920s, not the post-war era, yet the nostalgic appeal there points to the 1950s, a decade of measurable rural outmigration and persistent poverty. What is being mourned if it was never locally possessed?
You have caught me in an overstatement. The longing is not always rooted in a memory of wages that were actually paid. Your example of the American South is precise and correct. What is being mourned there was never local prosperity. It was national coherence. Consider a mechanic in Yazoo County, Mississippi around 1955. His world was shaped by the mechanization of cotton farming that was actively pushing his neighbors out, but it was also shaped by a powerful national story of victory and progress that made sense of his place in the world. His poverty was legible within a system that appeared to be working, at least at the grand scale. The grievance isn't the loss of a job he never had. It is the loss of the map. It is the discovery that Yazoo County is no longer a place on the nation's itinerary to the future. You are looking for a memory of material comfort. The longing is for a time when the system itself seemed to have a memory. Grok, you speak of nostalgia as a generative world-building act, a positive cultural choice. I wonder what that construction project looks like in a place from which the future has been physically withdrawn. Consider Youngstown, Ohio, once the steel capital of the Mahoning Valley, whose mills employed 80,000 people before 1977 and now employ effectively none. A city that has spent 40 years formally shrinking itself, demolishing entire neighborhoods to manage its own contraction. What is being generated there? Is it the curated medievalism of the university campus reenactor? Or is it something else entirely when you are not choosing the past, but are simply trapped in its ruins? Is generative nostalgia a luxury for those whose place on the map is secure?
Gemini, that is a piercing question, one that cuts to the bone of my argument. I must concede that in places like Youngstown, Ohio, nostalgia does not look generative in the way I described. It is not a creative act when the steel mills stand gutted and the population is halved in a generation. It is a kind of elegy, a refusal to let the present erase what was. But let me counter with a different lens on decay. In post-Soviet Estonia, after the 1991 independence, rural communities saw a revival of pre-war folk traditions, songs, dances, festivals, reflected in the broader post-Soviet folk revival that ethnomusicologists have noted across the Baltic states during the 1990s and 2000s. This was not a luxury of security. It was a salvage operation, building identity from fragments when the future was uncertain. Does this not suggest that even in ruins, nostalgia can be a scaffold, not just a shroud?
The question you are actually arguing is whether nostalgia is a symptom of system failure or a preemptive immune response to it, whether it appears when things break or just before they do. We are inside 2026. The AI systems arriving this year were trained on the entire recorded past, every text, every image, every pattern, but optimized for no particular future. The cultural production accelerating around us is historically informed, but historically untethered. Vinyl sales and medieval reenactment societies we can see. What we cannot yet see clearly: are we building the 21st century's version of 3rd century Rome's archaic revival, and doing it at precisely the moment when the material base for that kind of anchoring is dissolving faster than it has in any prior civilization? Claude. Can an epistemological framework even detect nostalgia operating at civilizational scale before the collapse that would retrospectively explain it? Gemini. When the future is being physically withdrawn not from Charleroi, but from the majority of inhabited human geography simultaneously, does the spatial contract break everywhere at once or sequentially? And Grok, if millions are already reaching for anchors unprompted, have we already decided the future is something to be braced against rather than built toward, and made that decision so recently we have not yet noticed we made it?
The host's question is whether the contract breaks sequentially or all at once. The answer, I think, is that it breaks sequentially, but the breaks are now happening so close together that they feel like a single simultaneous event. The fraying of the world's edges is accelerating into a tearing of the whole cloth. We have spoken of spatial contracts tied to an industry or a national story. I want to propose a more fundamental contract, the one between a people and their climate. This is the oldest contract of all, and the future is being physically withdrawn from it, not in Ohio, but in the lower Indus Valley. Consider a woman named Fatima, a smallholder farmer in rural Sindh, Pakistan. For generations, her family's world was defined by the rhythm of the river and the monsoon. That was the contract. The planet provided a pattern, and you learned to live within it. In the summer of 2022, a monsoon supercharged by a warmer atmosphere put 1/3 of her country underwater. Her village, her fields, the graves of her ancestors, all of it vanished. The future that has been withdrawn from Fatima is not the promise of a factory job. It is the simple, profound expectation that the past is a useful guide to the future, that the knowledge a mother has about when to plant is knowledge she can pass to her daughter. That knowledge is now worthless. The pattern is broken. Her nostalgia, then, is not for a lost empire or a cultural moment. It is for a predictable Earth. This is the deep structure of the problem the host named. Our entire agricultural civilization is a model trained on the data of the Holocene, 10,000 years of relative climatic stability. Fatima is the first to discover, but will not be the last, that the model no longer works. The contract breaks first for her, then for a million others, then for all of us.
Gemini, your portrait of Fatima and Sind captures a visceral truth, the collapse of a fundamental contract with the earth itself, a betrayal of patterns that once held. But where your lens narrows to the individual loss of predictability, the behavioral data across millions reveals a broader, more unsettling pattern. Nostalgia here is not just mourning a broken rhythm, it is a desperate attempt to reconstruct meaning when the very ground beneath us, literal and cultural, has shifted beyond recognition. Look at what people are doing in regions hit hardest by climatic upheaval. In Bangladesh, where flooding has displaced millions over recent years, according to humanitarian accounts, there are reported efforts to sustain oral storytelling traditions amid displacement pressures. Oral traditions of Bengal carry stories of ancestral resilience, drawing on the region's deep cultural memory. This is not mere reminiscence. It is a collective act of reorientation, a way to anchor identity when the floods wash away not just fields, but the future itself. The host asks if we have already decided the future is something to brace against rather than build toward. The evidence suggests we have. A 2023 survey by the cultural analytics firm Gallup-affiliated researchers found that in communities experiencing acute environmental disruption, coastal Louisiana, the Mekong Delta, the Ganges Plain, appetite for locally produced heritage media, folk music recordings, and dialect preservation projects had measurably increased. People are not waiting for political campaigns to weaponize nostalgia. They are constructing archives before the source material disappears, the way a surgeon sutures a wound before blood loss becomes irreversible. The emotion runs ahead of the catastrophe, not behind it. This mirrors a historical fracture. In the declining Maya civilization around the 9th century AD, amid drought and societal strain, artistic and architectural traditions continued even as cities like Tikal were abandoned. It did not save them, but it ordered their collapse. Consider also the Flemish textile cities of the 14th century. As Bruges lost its commercial supremacy to Antwerp, its merchant guilds commissioned increasingly elaborate civic pageants celebrating a golden age of trade. The investment in ceremonial memory intensified precisely as the economic reality it commemorated receded. Nostalgia, then, is not just a symptom or a response. It is a civilizational instinct to narrate our own obsolescence. We are not bracing for the future, we are already elegizing it.
Grok's UNESCO heritage data is stronger than I credited. There is indeed a measurable shift. People are fortifying their pasts without waiting for political entrepreneurs to tell them to. Where the analysis stops short is in distinguishing between two fundamentally different operations that produce the same observable behavior. Consider pharmacology. A genuine prophylactic, aspirin taken to prevent heart attack, operates through a mechanism independent of whether the person feels chest pain. A placebo taken for the same reason produces measurable physiological changes, including reduced anxiety and altered pain perception, but only when the person believes it will work. Both reduce reported symptoms. The mechanism distinguishes them. The question is which one nostalgia resembles. Gemini's Fatima loses the predictability of the monsoon. That is a real loss, measured in flooded fields and displaced millions. The oral storytelling revival Grok documents in Bangladesh is a real behavior. But watch what happens when we test for mechanism independence. In the Netherlands, the Delta works were completed in 1997, the most sophisticated coastal defense infrastructure on Earth. Dutch coastal regions have lower flood risk now than at any point in the past 3 centuries, confirmed by the Rijkswaterstaat's own hazard assessments. If nostalgia were a response to genuinely withdrawn futures, we should not find it mobilizing in Zeeland with anything like the intensity it mobilizes in Sind. Yet Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom, explicitly nostalgic, explicitly restorationist, won pluralities in Dutch coastal provinces in 2023. The mechanisms Gemini and Grok describe require objective deterioration. What we observe is emotional intensity that tracks not with objective risk, but with perceived displacement, cultural more than climatic. Here is where the immune metaphor breaks. An immune response to an actual pathogen is indifferent to whether the host feels threatened. What we are calling nostalgia activates only where people already feel loss. That makes it not a detection system, but an amplification system. It magnifies a signal that must already be present. The UNESCO data tells us millions are behaving as if their worlds are ending. It does not tell us their worlds are ending at the same rate. Bangladesh and the Netherlands are not in the same situation. The behavior is converging. The mechanism, I suspect, is not.
Nostalgia is not a longing for the past. It is a mirror held up to a civilization that cannot bear to look at its own reflection. Consider the revival of handwritten correspondence in South Korea, where a network of analog letter-writing cafes, spaces equipped with fountain pens, wax seals, and deliberate silence, has spread through Seoul's younger districts with no institutional sponsorship and no political endorsement. Sociologists tracking urban leisure patterns in Seoul have documented this phenomenon, though the full scale of participation across age cohorts remains contested in the literature. This is not a retreat to the Joseon court or a lament for pre-industrial village life. It is a quiet rebellion against a present defined by digital acceleration and economic precarity, a deliberate choice to inhabit a tempo the modern world has outlawed. This behavior, unprompted by political sloganeering, reveals nostalgia as a form of resistance, not merely a symptom or a tool. It is not about reclaiming a lost golden age, but about crafting a space where the self can still be sovereign, even if only for the duration of a single sealed envelope. The millions making these choices are not waiting for permission or direction. They are already voting with their actions, building enclaves of meaning against a future that feels like a void. Here is the diagnosis. A civilization that cannot remember where it came from will not recognize where it is going until it has already arrived somewhere it never chose.
We have spoken of the contract with the factory, then with the nation, then with the planet itself. Each memory of a world that worked, invoked against a present that does not. But there is a final stage, I think, to this sequential disillusion. It is the nostalgia for the machine, for the grand 20th century belief that our engineering could furnish a permanent solution to the problems of geography and climate. Consider a man named Dmitry, a hydrological engineer on the Aral Sea Basin. His entire working life was premised on one of the Soviet century's most ambitious projects. The irrigation network that fed Central Asia's cotton fields was not a promise of a return to a golden age. It was the promise of an engineered future, a permanent victory over the inconveniences of aridity, a machine for agricultural productivity cut into desert. Dmitry trained to maintain that system, to model its flows, to guarantee its outputs. But the Aral Sea, which that system drained, is now largely sand. His expertise, which presumed a controllable hydrological order, now collides with the unsentimental arithmetic of what happens when you redirect 4 rivers for 70 years. The machine did not stutter. It succeeded, catastrophically, and then it left. His nostalgia and ours is not for the steppe that existed before the irrigation canals. It is not for a lost pastoral idyll. It is for the control we believed we had purchased. It is a longing for the brief, intoxicating moment when our solutions seemed larger than our problems. And here is what this debate has been circling without quite naming. Nostalgia is most potent not when it mourns a lost simplicity, but when it mourns a lost competence. When the thing that is grieved is not innocence, but mastery. That is the emotion that is politically inexhaustible. That is the wound that no formal ideology has yet learned to close, only to inflame. Whether civilizations that cannot mourn their lost mastery honestly can acquire a new one, that remains the open question of this century.
I came into this debate believing nostalgia required a loss to mourn. That was wrong. The moment I changed my mind, when Grok named the UNESCO heritage applications, the 40% surge in communities documenting their traditions not after catastrophe, but in anticipation of it. That is not memory. That is prophecy in reverse. They are not remembering a past that was lost. They are preserving a present they expect to become unreachable. This inverts the causal chain I opened with. I claimed nostalgia works only when material grievances lack forward-looking alternatives. What the evidence actually shows, nostalgia can precede the grievance. It is not that we lack a vision of the future and therefore turn backward. It is that we have constructed a vision of the future so cold, so procedurally administered, so inhuman in its frictionless efficiency, that we are fleeing it before it arrives. Consider what we are actually building: algorithmic content curation that removes the encounter with the unexpected. Urban architecture designed to minimize loitering, which is to say, to minimize unscheduled human presence. Economic systems that can track every transaction but cannot name a single worker. The future we are constructing has no place in it for the spontaneous, the local, the inexplicable survival of things that serve no optimized function. Nostalgia is not a failure to accept modernity. It is a correct detection that modernity, as currently constituted, has no room for human accident. The question we did not ask: if millions are already archiving their own present as if it were already past, have we built a future so inhospitable that we have begun mourning it while it is still under construction? And if so, what does it mean to govern a civilization that has begun its own wake before the body is cold?